The Trump death clock now lives in Times Square at 43rd and 7th at 1500 Broadway. That's the building that it's at. And, what we found, people read my editorial when I was writing it for the Washington Post, and I showed it to friends and acquaintances who were supportive of what I was thinking, but they're, giving me good editorial ideas. And over time, they said, if you're so focused on the death clock, why don't you find out about putting a death clock in the real world? Why just do it as a website? And of course, I had thought about that, but I didn't know, my gosh, what must a billboard cost, or a big clock to put up? Well, when we poked around a little bit, friends had offered to give some support. We found that, maybe not surprisingly, billboard space is not very expensive right now, because after all, there's nobody on the streets in the height of a pandemic if people are sort of living by the guidelines that they've been supposed to be under. And that means that billboard space in New York was much, much more affordable than one would have ever dreamt, a tiny, tiny fraction of what it would usually cost to advertise in Times Square. It was one of the most expensive areas of the world. So some friends put together some support to really put it up and start the ball rolling, which we hope will roll across the country. We hope that the Trump death clock in New York can be emulated in small towns and big cities across the country, where people can get a billboard that's sitting dormant, or they can actually just project it. Those little projectors that people have, you can project it on a building, you can project it on your house, just to remind your community of what the incredible cost has been of the reckless handling of this. And this is not just about being critical. As you say, this could have happened to any president. So the fact is, there is a specific calculation that we base the death clock on. We're not just saying, oh, Donald Trump, you've been bad in some general blurry way. We wanted to find the single calculation that was most damning and most specific. In other words, we looked for the most conservative number. And that number was so damning that, reasonable people will debate. The president's defenders will say, oh, it was China's fault, or it was the World Health Organization, or it was the CDC, or blame individuals, blame anybody but the White House. Well, they can do that. Trump's detractors will point to things that happened much earlier, like that his team disbanded the White House Pandemic Directorate in 2018 and got rid of people chiefly concerned with this kind of outbreak. Or they might have pointed to, they want to say, well, in January and February, the intelligence services gave the president countless warnings about the need to move quickly. That is all true, and reasonable people can debate that, but they can debate it till they're not reasonable. We wanted a single calculation, and that's the basis of the Trump death clock, which just looks at one period around which there is no debate, and that is the period between March 9 and March 16. And after Dr. Fauci and others made clear that they acknowledge that mitigation guidelines were not put in when they should have been, the question is, okay, what was the cost of that? Because when a virus is spreading exponentially, as viruses do, every second counts. And in my view, every life counts. So the question is, the seconds that you lost, Mr. President, while you dithered. Look at South Korea. South Korea, at that same moment that we were beginning to see the outbreak of this, they instituted mitigation guidelines, and they ended up with 300 deaths to our 70, 80,000. So you're in a position where the enormity of the mistake, Donald Trump made a political calculation. Whatever his reasoning was, he made a bet, the bet failed, was a failure. At what cost? And at what cost being borne by the American people?
We're talking to Eugene Jarecki, who has just erected the Trump death clock in Times Square. Eugene, have you gotten response from the administration?
We have not heard from the administration. Most of what we've heard from, frankly, are from people who are detractors of the president, who wish that we had used a higher number. They say your death clock only shows that the administration is sort of attributable to 60% of the death toll in America, because that's what it shows. Basically, Doctors Jewell and Jewell, in the piece they published in the New York Times and in other releases of their findings, said had the president and his team moved on March 9, rather than March 16, 60% of American lives would have been saved. That's a harrowing statistic. That puts us today, at this moment, at 48,337 deaths could have been averted had mitigation guidelines been put in place earlier. To me, that is damning enough. And to try to go earlier and enter the debate, the big echo chamber of hyperbolic claims that'll go in both directions, they may even have truth in them. But the president will try to use that to get out of accountability. The goal here is to require accountability, to demand it. Amy, thousands of people lost their lives needlessly, and in their name, we must demand not just accountability, but more responsible and more responsive leadership going forward.